Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of September of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First, we're going to start with the Black Sea. Today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack and to land their infantry and troopers in the western part of Crimea. As usually as the Ukrainians did that before, for these purposes, the Ukrainians were using the Snake Island as the something like middle base, and after the Snake Island, the Ukrainians started their movements in direction of the western part of Crimea. The Russians, for repelling purposes, were using their aircrafts like Su-30, Su-35, and as a result of counterattack, the Ukrainian small fleet was destroyed. There was like 3 ships were destroyed. Some of the Ukrainian soldiers sank in the Black Sea, but the rest were managed to survive and to retreat. And the question is, of course, as usually, what is the purpose of these attacks? What is the purpose of those attacks? Because this is not the first attempt. That was not the first attempt during the previous months on August and September. As I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, the Ukrainians made at least 5 or 4 or 6 attempts to do this. And furthermore, during one of the attacks, the Ukrainians managed to land their troopers and to make some photos, and after that, they retreated. So from the basic perspective, from the basic understanding, probably, and we can say that Ukrainians are planning to create a bridgehead and foothold in the western part of Crimea to capture this territory, to land the troopers and so on. But if you ask my opinion, I believe that this operation is impossible. Not just like highly unlikely the Ukrainians are able to implement. This is impossible, because even if they're able to land their troopers to capture some foothold, they will be destroyed immediately. Now, the only possible case, if they have superiority, missile superiority, artillery superiority, fleet superiority, and all these superiority can allow the Ukrainians to keep this territory as long as possible. Furthermore, even if the Ukrainians are able to land, they need few thousands of soldiers to control this territory, and just few thousands to control. And imagine yourself how many forces they need to start this operation. Probably to land their troopers and to capture this foothold, they need to use up to 20,000 of Ukrainians, and just 5 or 6 will survive after such operation, and they will be able to hold this territory probably for a day, but not more. So that means that Ukrainians also understand the situation. They understand that this operation is just, it has another purposes, not to create a foothold. Media victory, probably, but this media victory is too expensive. So you're sending soldiers just to death, like to die, and nothing more, just to make photos and to tell the Western countries that we can to get more weapon. I believe that Ukrainians will not understand the situation. The only explanation I have with these operations is to force the Russians to use aircrafts as often as possible. So currently the Ukrainians are trying to implement the same situation as they did with the Moscow Chrysler when they destroyed this ship using the Neptune missiles, Harpoon missiles, and they made that because they forced Russians to move their fleet as close as possible to the shore, and after that the ship was destroyed. Currently the Ukrainians are trying to do the same. They're trying to force the Russians to use aircrafts as often as possible, and they're trying to collect as much as possible data, and at some point they will start trying to shut the Russian aircrafts down and to create something like close air above this part of the Black Sea. At least this is the only explanation I have about the situation in the Black Sea and about the Ukrainians' attempt to land their troopers on the western part of Ukraine. When talking about Kherson, as you can see, we haven't received nothing, no geolocations for the previous 24 hours, just the numbers of the Ministry of Defense that as a result of artillery duels and clashes, the Ukrainians lost another 20 soldiers. Now we're moving to Zaporozhye area, and today we got a lot of very interesting updates, and probably the most important updates are coming from the Stepnogorsk area, from the western flank of Zaporozhye, Orekhov battle and so on. We see the increase of the intensifying of Russian activity in this direction. Today we got a lot of details, a lot of updates, how the Russian drone forces were attacking the Ukrainians, how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians' accumulation of forces, the Ukrainian strongholds, the Ukrainian light vehicles, supply machine, rotation machines, and so on, how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian strongholds in the forest lines in the north of Zhiribyanki, how the Russians... So we see a real intensifying of actions, and the question is, what is the purpose of this intensifying? Probably all these attacks can mean at least two things. The first one is that Ukrainians have accumulated significant number of forces in this direction, and the Ukrainians are planning to restart their offensive operation in direction of Vasilyovka. From the other side, we understand the second option is that maybe the Russians have accumulated their forces in this direction, and the Russian purpose is to counterattack and to collapse and finally to stop the Ukrainian attempts to attack the Russians in Zaporozhye area, because if the Russians are able to penetrate and to collapse this flank, the entire battle of Zaporozhye will be ended immediately, because the Ukrainians will be forced to send forces to the west to stop the Russians and not to allow them to develop their offensive operation further in direction of the mainland. Very interesting video we got from the settlement by the name of Lyubimovka, and this video we can see how the Russians attacked another Ukrainian tank, another Ukrainian armored vehicle in this direction using Lancet. And this video we're using just for learning purposes, to understand and realize the distance, how deep the Russians are able to get inside of the Ukrainians' defense, and how deep the Russians are able to discover and destroy Ukrainian machines and Ukrainian mechanized forces. And this is not the only video. Yesterday we got from the same direction another video, the second, and on this video, according to the Russian sources, the Russians managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian command center, like mobile command center that Ukrainians used for some, let's say, purposes. So the same area, another different type of weapon, 2 Lancet, 2 strikes, 2 destroyed vehicles. And if we calculate the distance, let's say from this area to the main Russian positions, we're gonna see that the Russians, let's say from Mirne, let's assume that the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians from somewhere from Mirne, we see that the distance was around 26 kilometers. So something happened. It's not just one case, 2 strikes in a row, and the Ukrainians haven't managed to do anything. So that means that there is a real air defense problem, at least in this part of the front line. Now we are moving to the battle for Robotyno, to the Bradley Square. Today we got a lot of very interesting videos, and probably the most important video we got is Ukrainian attempt to attack Novoprokopovka from the northeast. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians sent 2 tanks to attack the Russians, and that I don't think that was a real attack. That was just reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat. The main purposes of Ukrainians was just to use the magazine to unpack everything, to attack the Russian positions, just to pin them down, not to allow the Russians to counterattacks and so on. And the second purpose of that attack was, of course, reconnaissance operation. The Russians tried to figure out and to find out the Russian air fire positions, Lancet positions, drone positions, the Russians' anti-tank positions, and so on. Probably as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians managed to collect a lot of very useful information. And now the next stage, the next step in this situation is like to provide this operation information to the Ukrainian artillery forces, drone forces, and I expect that within the next 24 hours the Ukrainian artillery forces and drone forces will be activated, and we're going to receive more updates of Ukrainian attempts to counterattack and to destroy the Russian tanks and so on. Also in this video we can see a Russian attempt to attack the Ukrainian tank with Lancet. You see the Lancet, but the Russians missed, and the tank managed to survive. So something like this. So very interesting battle. When talking about the map, I will try to show you on the map the movements if you don't feel good with the geolocations. So the Ukrainians started movements on the north. They reached this defense belt, then they turned, let's say, to the west, moved to another, let's say, defense belt forest line, and then they turned to the north. Somewhere, so that was the Ukrainian road, how they were moving with the tank, with those 2 tanks. They were moving from the north, south. From all along their road, the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions. It was like just a fire without targeting. They was just attacking, trying to destroy and to attack the edge Russian positions. When the tanks get this line, and when they turned their back, the Russians made few attacks, and We remember that Lancet strike, and Lancet strike took place somewhere in this area, and the Russians missed. So that was the entire battle. That was a small episode of the Battle of Novoprokopovka. The Ukrainians probably managed to get as much as possible information. The Russians haven't managed to shut down even a single tank. Another interesting details we are getting from the south of Robotyne, fresh videos, more attempts of the Russian forces to attack the Ukrainian infantry, Ukrainian troops on the northern fortification of Novoprokopovka, that and the southern or the southern of Robotyne and northern of Novoprokopovka. And that means that the Ukrainians still control this territory. The Russians, if you remember, during the previous weeks made few attempts to counterattack. There was even an update that the Russians counterattack in the central and the western part of Robotyne to counterattack in this direction. But as we can see, all those attacks from the Russian side were failed, and the Ukrainians still control the hills. And now they started the storming process on Novoprokopovka, and this is the first phase, the reconnaissance in force or reconnaissance in combat. We expect more details and more attacks from the Ukrainian drones. Also, the Russians established full control over the roads and supply roads that goes to the south. The Ukrainians had significant losses while redeploying their forces, but as we can see, this situation doesn't stop them. They continue to send more and more forces, and without securing the flanks. As we discussed, the most important road that Ukrainians use for supplying their forces goes from Novodanilovka in direction of Robotyne, and then they move a little bit to the east and then to the south, and all this road is under complete Russian fire control, and the loss of Ukraine is significant. When talking about the Battle of Verbova, we haven't received nothing during the previous 24 hours. For some reason, the Ukrainians haven't published even a single video of drone strikes or artillery strikes and so on. The Russians as well haven't published nothing, just a small video how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions or moving along the fields. And at some second, some sources are saying that the Ukrainian striker got on mine, and as a result of detonation, the Ukrainian striker was destroyed. So that's it. So no activity on this direction at all. Just Ukrainians published few videos of counter-artillery duels, how they destroyed few artillery systems with HIMARS strikes. One more time, they're using just long-range artillery systems to have at least some superiority, to have at least some success. When talking about low-range and middle-range artillery systems, the Russians have significant superiority in comparison with the Ukrainians. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers. So we see that the numbers of losses completely correlates with the situation. No geolocated videos, no activity, just small actions, so that's why the level of losses are very low. But when talking about artillery systems, another day in a row, probably the 10th day in a row, when the Ukrainians had significant losses among artillery systems, mainly among low and middle range artillery systems. The Ukrainians lost Akatse, M107, M119, 198, M777, and so on. And another important thing that we need to mention is that the Ukrainians, for the previous 24 hours, also haven't lost even a single HIMARS. And this is very important because if you ask my opinion, I don't remember when exactly the Ukrainians did lose this type of weapon, this type of artillery systems. Now we are moving to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, probably this area currently the most important, the most active. There are a lot of noise from this territory, and mainly the Ukrainians are trying to attack the Russian positions from Zolotaya Niva in direction of Novodonetsk. Another road of attack is from Prichistovka in direction of Novomayorsk. When talking about the Battle of Novodonetsk, a few sources were saying that Ukrainians managed to enter the northern part, but the Russians counterattack and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. So basically, saying simply, the Ukrainians were defeated in Novodonetsk. At least for some period of time, they will make a small pause while the Ukrainians will try to complete or to achieve something in Novomayorsk. Because when talking about this direction, the Ukrainians did manage to establish some control. Of course, they paid for these few buildings in the northwestern part of the settlement significant price. Dozens of destroyed armored vehicles, probably hundreds of killed or wounded Ukrainian soldiers, just for few streets, for few buildings in the northwestern part of the settlement, which probably are already reduced to ruins by the Russian artillery forces. I know that the Russians also use some pattern. First, they try to attack the Ukrainian forces with artillery systems, and after that, the second phase is to attack the Ukrainians with TOS flamethrower systems, and the final stage is to attack and bomb Ukrainian positions with FAB. Currently, we are on the first phase of Russian counter-artillery duels, artillery attacks. Now we don't see, but as soon as we get the geolocated videos of TOS flamethrower system usage, this is going to be the first evidence that the Russians took a decision to leave the settlement, but yet we haven't received nothing like that. Another video of attempt from the Ukrainian side to move some infantry, to land some troopers, to make rotation, storming process of the trenches. Everything is under very heavy fire, so the clashes in these directions are very heavy, and yes, the Ukrainians managed to achieve some success, but nobody knows the price they paid for that attack. And one more time, during the day we haven't received any confirmations about any progress or whether that attack was real or not, that the Russians counterattacked from Priyutin and managed to recapture some positions. We haven't received nothing, like just a few text messages from different Telegram channels without any evidence and photo and geolocations on the ground. So for now, we're not going to color this territory because of absence and lack of evidence about any attempts and any success from the Russian side in this direction. The Ministry of Defense reported that as a result of clashes on this direction, the Ukrainians lost 130 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles. Anyway, the number of losses probably tell us that there is real clash, there are real clashes, real hot situation, and let's see how this situation is going to be finished. Now we are moving to the South Marinka direction. The Ukrainians probably moved some artillery systems to the combat line and start making at least some counter-artillery duels with the Russians. And they published a few videos how they managed to destroy another D-30 howitzer, probably some ammo depot inside the settlement by the name of Stepnoye. The Russians from their side destroyed another Ukrainian positions ammo depot that located in the settlement by the name of Paraskovivka, between Konstantinovka and Novomikhailivka. Anyway, no matter the Ukrainian artillery system, the Russians continue bombing and shelling the settlements, these 3 settlements, and I expect that from day to day they will finally launch offensive operation with the purpose to clear this territory, to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belt, and to strike the Ukrainians in their flank of their assault force, offensive forces of Vremivka tactical bridgehead. When talking about Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost nothing, just few corrections according to the geolocated videos, just few bombings in Pervomaisk, and according to these bombings we have adjusted the map, because as I understand, during the previous counterattacks the Ukrainians managed to restore some control over the city, over the fields, and I have already adjusted the map because probably the fields between these streets and these fields are or in the gray zone or under Ukrainian control. When talking about entire Donetsk direction, as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost 260 soldiers and 7 armored vehicles. The interesting part of the report is that during the previous day, the Ukrainians haven't lost even a single artillery system, and the question is, why is that? Or the Ukrainians took a decision to remove artillery system from the combat line because of losses, or probably they was very successful. Yet we haven't received any confirmation of any of these theories. When talking about the situation on the ground, the Ukrainians continue bombing and attacking the Russians with FPV drones, their artillery positions, the tanks, and mainly in the vicinity of Andreevka. Still, the settlement is under Russian control. This is the vital question for the Ukrainians to capture Andreevka. For these purposes, they try to do their best, but as you can see, no chances, and yet they haven't managed to develop. Furthermore, the Ukrainians located under very heavy artillery fire along the railways, along the these forest lines. They don't have normal supply and support, and for now it's very difficult to say. From one side, we can say that the Ukrainians managed to encircle the Russian and establish some operational encirclement of Russian positions in Andreevka, but from the other side, we can say the same situation about the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians by themselves enter the artillery bags, artillery pockets, and currently the Ukrainians move their forces into operational encirclement, and the Russians also can attack and strike have already have some fire control over the supply roads, because if you ask my opinion, I can't even imagine how the Ukrainians can support their forces along these forests. It's like suicide operation. Today there was published another video. I'm not sure that this video is new. Maybe this is an old one, an episode of the battle that took place some months ago. But anyway, this is the situation. A few armored vehicles were trying to move to storm Andreevka, but they got on the minefields and were basically destroyed. Another bad updates are coming from Ivanovska, from the central part of the settlement. Basically, without like geolocations and so on, the Russians establish full 100% control over this territory using FPV drones, using artillery strikes. The situation is critical for the Ukrainians. They can't use the area between Bogdanovka, Kalinivka, Ivanovska to make rotations, to make forces exchange, to send forces from the north to the south, from the south to the north. For these purposes, they need to use Chasov Yar, Mykolaievka, Petechina, Canal to cross pontoon bridges that are under complete Russian fire control. So the situation is very critical, and if we increase the number of updates even from the beginning of September, we see how the Russians are focused in this area. They have 100% control, they have 100% superiority, and we see almost complete absence from the Ukrainian side of any counter-drone duels with the Russians that control the Ivanovsk and the central part of this sector. The situation is not very good for the Ukrainians, and meanwhile, and never even with this situation, the Ukrainians still try to capture Andreevka, and we also see that they don't have any progress in this direction as well. When talking about Kupiansk and Liman front lines, we haven't got any updates, just the Ukrainians published few videos how they destroyed and bombed the Russian positions in the settlement. On this video we see how the Ukrainians discovered the Russian positions in the settlement by the name of Chernova-Popovka, and after that they started bombing and shelling the settlement, and as a result of those clashes they managed to destroy few artillery systems. So probably this is the only let's say successful episode of counter-artillery duels from the Ukrainian side. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians discovered the Russian 2S4 Tulpan artillery system, very heavy mortar system that was also damaged and destroyed as a result of FPV drone strike. And we got another HIMARS strike, HIMARS missile attack against another Russian positions in this area. Also like another episode of some success of Ukrainian artillery duels on the northern direction. The Russians reported as a result of clashes on Kupiansk-Liman front line, the Ukrainians lost 85 soldiers. So the level of losses probably is the minimal in comparison with the previous days. But there is one region we need to we need to pay attention to, and we're talking about the settlement by the name of Pesky that located Pisky on the border with the Russians. And today the Ukrainians continue publishing the videos how they were bombing and attacking the Russian TOS flamethrower systems, the Russian supply machines, the Russian regular trucks, armored vehicles, and so on, raiders, and so on. So the Russians, as we discussed a few minutes ago, established 100% control over the Ukrainian positions in Ivanovsk, that located on the west of Artyomovsk. But the Ukrainians somehow managed to establish 100% control over the borderlands between Kupiansk front line and the mainland. The Russians, and if we increase the number of updates, let's say from the beginning of August, we see how the Ukrainians are focused, and even there's like too much. Let's start from the 1st of September. Most of the updates we got from the 1st of September. And you see how the Ukrainians are focused in this direction. A lot of videos, and mainly the Ukrainians attack supply machines, light vehicles, medicine machines, and so on. The Russians use these settlements as a main supply road to send forces, reinforcements, reserves in direction of Sinkovka and Kupiansk battle. And we see that Ukrainians found the key region, and currently the Russians need to do something if they want to be successful in the Kupiansk direction. Also, a lot of updates are coming from the capital of Ukraine, from Kiev region. During the previous night, the Russians made another strike, probably Geran strike or maybe Kinzhal strike against the Ukrainian ammo depot. As a result of that strike, there were very heavy explosions, and some sources are providing us unconfirmed information that with that attack, the Russians managed to discover and destroy Ukrainian uranium depleted munition store that we know that the Western countries, United States of America, promised the Ukrainians to send them such type of rounds, and rumors are saying that there is rumors that that ammo depot was destroyed. When talking about Kiev itself, also during the previous night there was Iran strikes, a lot of explosions, a lot of heavy fire, and so on. And the only interesting thing that we also need to mention in this video, that the Russians stopped making massive missile strikes, as we saw 2 months ago, 3 months ago, and so on. There may be two reasons of that. The first one is the Russians currently try to concentrate and accumulate as much as possible missiles before the Russian greatest offensive operation that, according to some sources, is going to take place during winter, late autumn, and so on. From the other side, the Russians are trying to accumulate the missiles because more and more sources are saying that this winter and this autumn the Russians will continue attacking the Ukrainian energy facilities to cut Ukrainians completely off from electricity and energy. So anyway, that means something, and this something we're going to see in the next few weeks or even months. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.